Hi, my name is Jasmine Abina, and me and my partner, Alexandria Garcia, looked into trying youths as adults. Now, what's the issue with this? So, more than 200,000 youths enter the adult criminal justice system each year, and this is an immense amount of youths of where their childhood is getting taken away from them. Our thesis is trying youth as adults is a curtain behind which lies racism, bias, and the degradation of our criminal justice system. The trying youth as adults is a process used to basically conduct legal racism on minorities rather than foster their rehabilitation. In a system that prides itself on the notion of rehabilitation, we are continuously focused on the conviction rather than the prevention. Trying youths as adults is not a form of rehabilitation, and instead is paraded around the media to cause emotional distress and further racial rhetoric. So, looking into the House of Refuge, from the moment there was a noticeable distinction and an effort towards helping delinquent youth, there were also noticeable distinctions in how they handled delinquent white children and delinquent minorities. The House of Refuge in 1825 was the first institution designed to house poor, destitute, and vagrant youth who were deemed by authorities to be on a path towards like delinquency. In this very first example of an attempt at juvenile for formation, minorities were continuously mistreated if they were not turned away. Even when amongst the most disadvantaged, minorities were given lesser treatment. This lesser treatment and lack of the same privileges given to other children is best explained through the social bond theory. Now, in this theory, this theory investigates why delinquent activities did not happen and the four underlying principles that keep juveniles from delinquent acts. These principles are attachment, commitment, belief, and involvement. The first bond is attachment, which deals with the emotional side of the theory. This component is commitment. This bond deals with rational people are willing, how rational people are when making decisions. The next is belief, which is the aspect of this theory that ties into a youth's moral compass. And then finally, we can talk about involvement, which is the degree at which youths are undertaking activities that will assist them in not partaking in delinquent acts. So, looking at this, it makes sense why those who were housed in the houses of refuge did, in fact, did not receive adequate rehabilitation, and how minorities that did not receive the same treatment were harshly viewed by the public for engaging in delinquent activities. They were not given the tools to prevent criminal behavior, yet they were condemned for partaking in them. To put this theory in a modern context, areas with large socioeconomical disparities cannot afford the same quality of involvement as others. Funding for after school clubs and sports often is minimal at best, and with families working long hours and multiple jobs to make ends meet, the amount of time needed for fully engaged involvement is highly unlikely for these youths to happen on a consistent basis. In addition to this, belief systems tend to vary, and it is incredibly easy for those who come from less to feel envious or even just angry towards jealous of other more fortunate youths. Those that work hard but still struggle may be reduced in the beliefs of morality and fairness, as they see time and time again those in power are corrupt yet paying far more. Like, basically, people that are doing honest work are not getting treated as fairly as people who are just getting things handed on them on silver platters. While there may be some level of commitment in their lives, it is hard for those to focus on cultivating a prosperous future when they have to focus on providing food for tonight's dinner. Their ability to flourish is minimized by their need to survive, basically. So they're focusing on the day to day and just getting through the day versus other more fortunate people in society don't have to worry about that as much. And then finally, attachments may be strong in home life or in surrounding friend groups. However, with all these other circumstances we've laid out, it makes sense that the attachment of someone coming from less of their surrounding world wouldn't be that strong. With an us, like they kind of have like an us against the world mentality, and it makes sense why those struggling and living without the four basic principles of the social bond theory resort to delinquent acts as a mean to cope with the faltering aspects of their lives. So now that we've explained how those coming from less may be inclined to participate in delinquent acts, now we want to discuss a theory that explains how those acts further impact the way they are viewed in society and how that all leads to juveniles being tried as adults. The labeling theory has an aspect called secondary deviance. Secondary deviance is the result of other people's negative responses to an individual's original act of deviance. And much like the social bond theory, there are four basic principles regarding this theory. The first one being the degree to which the label is made public. With this coinciding with our theory, we believe that society views minorities in a negative light implicitly, since this is how they were taught to do indirectly from others around them. This goes into the second, which is the degree to which others react to the labeled person in a negative light. Society has taught us to treat certain races more harshly based on their skin tone. This is rooted in the fear that they will continue on making like these delinquent acts if they do not treat them like criminals or repeat offenders, even if it's their first time committing a crime. So like an example would be like a drug dealer. They're primarily deviant for being a drug dealer, but then we add secondary deviance and say, oh, well, maybe they're also a murderer, so we should look into them in this certain crime. And then the third aspect of this explains the transformation in personal identity. When a person is continually put down or treated like a criminal, they will start to believe and feed into what society is saying. It's easier to be the stereotype than break away from it, essentially. And then the fourth aspect is the support from others who are involved in delinquency or acts popularly thought as deviant. All these points strengthen why we label individuals as deviant. In turn, these individuals adjust their behaviors to align with their deviant stereotypes. And then the other theories that we're going to go over, I'm going to let my partner Alexandria take over.
So these theories that Jasmine touched on, they further explain how those in less privileged situations seem to have the world against them. And now we want to discuss the system that is against them and the unfair distribution of juveniles being tried as adults. So this unequal distribution leans heavily in favor of Caucasians, while minorities yet again receive the brunt, as we've continuously seen in history. So we analyze a scholarly article to fully understand the underlying reasons for this unequal distribution. So according to Manipulating Public Opinions About Trying Juveniles as Adults, an experimental study, the way in which a case is presented and the wording is incredibly impactful in how we perceive the accused. So this is incredibly relevant today because often we see a huge difference in verbiage when discussing minorities and Caucasians committing the same exact crime. So a real quick example of that is the two young children that stole cars. So the African-American child that stole a car was condemned, potentially facing criminal charges. There was a lot of scrutiny towards that child, while the white child, actually, it was seen to be comical, something funny, a cute, whimsical story, and in fact was featured on the news when they were the same crime. These two children took a car and drove it, and one of them was chased by police and ran away from police, the white child, yet still that story was seen as comical. When you look at any form of media, such as the news or any story coverage, it is important to consider how the story is being told and the impact that the phrasing could have on the way that the story is digested. So we have another example of how the media's perception of a case changes based off of race, and how we feel that the verbiage the verbiage is used in society furthers these biases. So with this actual article itself that we read, it said variation in the wording of surveys can produce very different responses and can result in inaccurate and unreliable assessments of public sentiment. So we try to assert that what is being said in the media and how those phrases are being explained to the mass is affecting how we perceive certain situations, whether recognized or subconscious. And as a result of that, it's a continuous bias that we pick up from a young age, because we're seeing all of these different perceptions, or all of these different biases taught onto us, and then we use those throughout the rest of our lives. And it makes its way all the way up through the juvenile system, because when we start viewing these children as just a product of our biases, and instead of giving them an accurate, fair trial, we have these perceptions that are placed upon ourselves. And in addition to that, just the verbiage of how we explain these crimes in itself could be more important than the crime itself. So with the case that we found, it happened in 2009. So Jordan Brown, he was an 11-year-old from Wampum, Pennsylvania, and he is accused, or was accused, of using his youth-sized 20-gauge shotgun to shoot and kill his father's pregnant fiance. And the speculation is that he was jealous of the attention. The fiance had 2 daughters, and the child that she was expecting was a boy, so they expected that he was jealous of the attention, not only of the child, but also that he would no longer be the only male child. Well, this crime, it's incredibly gruesome. The verbiage of the story was even more telling about society's impression of white juveniles. So Jordan was described as an all-American boy. They continuously talked about how he had no criminal record whatsoever, even though he was 11. So that's not necessarily something very outstanding to not have run-ins with the law prior to murder at 11. And continuously, the verbiage that was used throughout the article just continuously kind of painted him in this light where they almost tried to make it seem like even the article wasn't sure if he shot and killed his father's fiance. When they addressed the evidence that was presented in the case, there was gunpowder residue on his shirt. There was a hole burned in a blanket that was placed over the shotgun. So the implication there being that the shotgun was warm from being shot off and caused a hole in that blanket, or burned a hole in that blanket. And that the gunpowder was on his shirt because he was the one that shot it. And while that does seem kind of like concrete evidence, the article said, well, the boy liked to hunt, so gunpowder could have been on all of his shirts. We don't know. And they were reserving, they seemed to take the stance of reserving a lot of judgment while still using verbiage that was in his defense. So they took 2 kind of combative stances and never really addressed the potential that this child did do this. And rather than saying, how do we rehabilitate this child, it was all about maybe he didn't do it. And we see far too often that when an African-American child is placed in a similar situation, it's not that whatsoever. It's all about condemnation. It's all about their sentencing and the push to get them tried as an adult. But this article actually took an alternate approach and considered why this child should not be tried as an adult. And while personally it's always good to have that separation between juvenile and adult justice systems, the fact that there's just such this disparity in how we handle whether or not a child should be tried as an adult just sort of furthers this idea that there's something more than just this idea of crimes have punishment. So there is a lot of statistics behind the idea that there is a large disparity in who gets tried as an adult. So these are some statistics just from a couple counties in New Jersey. And you can already see based off of these that there's a huge issue that's not fully being discussed. So it says in Camden County that 68% of requests for Black kids are granted, 60% of requests for Hispanic kids are granted, while only 31% of requests for Caucasian kids are granted. And so there's more than double the amount granted for Black children compared to Caucasian children, which already is enough to question what is going on in Camden County. However, it's not just an isolated incident. So Passaic County, 78% of Black children, their requests are granted to be tried as an adult, or the request to try the children as adults, not them requesting it. 29% Hispanic and 38% of requests for Caucasian kids are granted. And there is, so again, it's about double. Cumberland County actually has the highest jump. So 45% of Black kids, their requests to have these children tried as adults are granted, 20% Hispanic and 17% Caucasian. So with that one, it's a more obvious disparity between African American children and everyone else. And so the statistics alone aren't enough to say per se why they're doing it, but just enough to say that there's a disparity there and there's an issue that needs to be addressed. And so we wanted to look even further, and we looked at the charges that end up getting a juvenile tried as an adult, and it just furthered the concern that should be rampant in society. So by charge, 43% of robberies are tried as an adult, but 26% of murder cases are tried as an adult. Drive-by shooting, 16%, assault, 6%, burglary, 3%, other 3%. So it's not violent crimes or very incredibly gruesome crimes. It doesn't really seem to be a matter of whether or not these people are a danger to society, because murder seems a lot more violent than most issues of, or most cases dealing with robbery. It's not a matter of violence. It seems to be solely a matter of race and implicit biases that we have, that we are legally allowed to use against these children unfairly. So it's also interesting that you can see, so 43% of African American children were tried as adults in this instance. Hispanics, 26%, and then it just keeps going down from there, all the way to 6% of Caucasians. So essentially, the crime is not important. It's more of the persecution of the child itself or their selves, and that has more of an impact rather than the amount of violence in the case or any other extenuating factor. This is a problem that seemingly has no one concrete solution, because across the country, at least in the United States, there's such an inconsistency in how we handle these cases. And each state really seems to have their own set of laws and regulations, and based off, each individual jurisdiction. But in doing so, it essentially means that a child committing the same crime could be charged with something different in every single state, might be charged as an adult in some, but a juvenile in others. And so there's no one concrete way that we're treating juveniles. And rather than, as we stated earlier, the emphasis on rehabilitation that was essential when cultivating the criminal justice system we have cultivated today, it turns into more of a persecution rather than even a prosecution. It's just a witch hunt looking for a way to rectify these issues and punish them, but only for certain children. And so what we assert is that education is the main key to starting this dialogue, to finding an issue, to cultivating those answers, and a better partnership with the community. So the four main things that we want to emphasize are the social bond theory elements. So we want more funding for after school programs, to have that higher commitment, to have that higher self-esteem, to have those higher relationships with the community, with themselves, with family. They all are important, and without that proper funding, these children obviously are going without it. If they can't fund it on their own, their parents can't fund it either. What are those children expected to do? And yet, when they do go down a delinquent path, we condemn them rather than trying to help them. So it's just this cyclical issue that seemingly has no end. However, if we were to help educate the communities about how to properly support a child and also help them, because some of them know how and they just don't have the means. In addition to that, we need to educate the public on these issues because not many people are talking about it. And I feel that if we were to educate them, more people would be outraged because this is outrageous and more people would want to do something about it. So we have to not only educate communities on a smaller scale, but the United States on a very large scale as well. We have to educate them to be critical thinkers when it comes to what is being consumed in the media. We have to be critical thinkers about how things are presented to us and the verbiage that's used and what that verbiage then has a result on us. Without all of these, there's no way for us to move forward as a collective one. And there will always be this distinct divide between those that are seeking the answers and the rest of the world that's being hidden and kept in the dark on purpose to help further this justice system